the three keywords in implementation is to establish repetitive routine. That means every week the routine is every name who's listed down on the 3-foot plan, if your name is there, you have to do it relentlessly, Monday to Friday, relentlessly. That's routine. On Friday, the routine is you look at the dashboard. You must look at the dashboard.
And explain why Friday.
Friday, because we want to spoil the weekends of those people who didn't do it.
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father-son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Today, we are continuing in our 8-part series looking at our 8 steps BFR, Big Fast Results methodology. So far, we've covered step 1, which was to start a strategic direction workshop. From there, after that, you move into labs. Once you've done the labs, we have talked about how we then have an open day. After we've done an open day, we talk about how we document all of this into a very clear roadmap. And then from the roadmap, we then went into talking last week about KPIs to ensure that things are delivered across all levels of the organization. And from there, today we talk about the importance of implementation.
This is very important.
Very, very important. You can have the best strategies, the best plans in the world, but if it is not implemented well, you're not really going to get anywhere. So, Dad, can you tell us about PEMANDU's approach to implementation? What does it look like to implement something well?
To implement something well means to do what you said you set out to do in a very simple layman term. So if you put in the roadmap, everything that the labs recommended, you said you're going to do, you must implement it. So that is what it is, to implement it so good that you get the results. That's really what it is.
Is there an example of poor implementation?
Well, I think probably the closest example is the Russia-Ukraine war. You may remember, Leon, in the year 1991, the Warsaw Pact was dismantled. If you rewind the clock, there was NATO, and there was the Warsaw Pact. And so at the time when the Soviet Union, the whole thing crumbled, the remaining part of the Eastern Bloc, which were part of the original Soviet Union, wanted to become much more aligned to the Western Europe. And so as a result of that, they had agreed. So the agreement at that time was, all the parties involved had agreed, including Russia, that they would dismantle the Warsaw Pact on condition that NATO does not expand its borders to encroach more and more into the countries in the Eastern Bloc, because Russia was very concerned. So they all agreed that was the agreement. So this is the point. When you do something, you agree to do it. And in the implementation, if you start doing something different, you run into the difficulties. And what has happened since 1991, NATO has continuously been expanding its borders to include a lot of the countries in the original Eastern Bloc. And all this while, Russia has reminding NATO, please remember, we have been in agreement with you that you don't do that. And they kept on doing that. If you want to know more about this, the history behind this, listen to all the YouTube videos by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He goes into tremendous details about this. And this has continuously been the problem that they have said. Russia kept on reminding NATO, you are not following the original roadmap that we've agreed, we dismantle it, but you do not go and encroach. And they kept on doing it. Until such time, a few years ago, they decided to invade Crimea. Russia then invaded Crimea and annexed it. And so that was the first thing. They said, we are dead serious about it. We're giving you a signal. If you keep on expanding yourself into those areas, this is the first signal. But NATO still are not listening to them, not taking heed to it. And so then Russia obviously told NATO and the rest of the countries, okay, maybe as a compromise, the Donbas region, which is the western tip of Ukraine, maybe that area can become semi-autonomous. We're not trying to annex it. It still remains as part of Ukraine. But what you then do is make sure that anything that's to do with military and security does not go into that area called the the neutral zone. And so that has never been agreed as well. And so that's the reason why today you see Russia deciding to go and invade them. So you notice today, this war should have never happened. The independence of Ukraine should have remained the same if only NATO had heeded to the original roadmap that they don't encroach into these countries. But that is the problem because, as I said, when you decide a particular plan, if you stick to it, that is meaning implement as per the plan. This example is they did not implement as per the plan or the agreement, and that's why you have a war today. So many people have died. Every single day as we speak today, that people are dying simply because what has happened here is a classic example of people not following the plan. Let me come closer to home. When I was in Malaysia Airlines, I spent 3 years and 8 months. We did all the plans to turn around the airline. We made record profits. And everybody knew what was needed to be done. But when I left, they're no longer implementing the same things as we did before. And when we reduced manpower by 3,000 people at the time, 3,052 to be precise.
Which a lot of people until today still think is the only way you were able to make money.
Yeah. But the year when we reduced the manpower, that was the year 2006. We did not make money in that year. And so that's the year we sold the building. So when we did that, 2.5 years later after I left, they've hired more than 4,000 people back.
Yeah, but I think maybe it might be worth reiterating what was the key lever. Because a lot of people would say, oh, Idris Jala only made money because he sold the building. How difficult can that be? So you already, as you rightly pointed out, that was not the lever for making money. That was just to prolong your runway because you were going to have no money to fly your aircraft. Yeah. So that was only to prolong your runway. Do you want to talk about what was the key lever?
The key lever was our flight P&L. We were looking at every individual flight and making dynamic pricing the key lever to make sure we turn around every flight throughout the year. And that was a key lever. And obviously what has not happened since I left, they've stopped doing the daily P&L and they did not use the daily profit and loss statement to govern the way the pricing and seat inventory sale was taking place. And that's why after I left, 5 CEOs after I left, they keep on losing money. But of course, they kept on losing money. I mean, of course, I will not say one of the things that made it very difficult was the loss of the 2 aircraft. And that obviously a devastating impact. But nonetheless, when you think about it, if you know what is the right thing to do and it's delivering results, you have to stick to the plan in implementation. So those, and we raising those as the example to say that if you don't implement what was in the plan, you really run into trouble. And so it's very important now to underline the point that however good the plan is, and if you are fail in implementation, you will not get the outcome. I lecture twice a year at the Harvard Ministerial Review. One of the people who lecture at the same program is Sir Michael Barber. And Sir Michael Barber, in his book, he wrote a couple of books, How to Run a Government. And in his book, he says, the plan needs to take 10% of your time and effort. 90% of your time and effort should be on implementation. So what Sir Michael Barber basically done in that book, underline maybe 10 times the importance of implementation. And that's why now that we clear the importance of implementation, we perhaps need to talk a little bit more about what exactly do we do in implementation, the PEMANDU style.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Sir Michael Barber as well, because I think in many ways, him and what he had done as part of Tony Blair's administration in setting up delivery unit was very much the prototype for then what PEMANDU would come to be. And so I think that segues quite nicely into how, right? We said, why is implementation important and how do we do it? So if we were to take that model and PEMANDU's model, what that looks like is actually essentially not just setting up a task force, although if you're maybe a smaller organization, that's a good way to go. But in this case, setting up almost an entire organization then to be able to focus 100% on delivery and on implementation. What does that process look like for a delivery unit? And then if you are, let's say, a smaller business, how can that be applied in that context?
Maybe I'll rewind the clock. At the time when we were setting up PEMANDU, we were really searching for a right model. How has it done in other countries where it has been very successful? And we were pointed in the direction of what they were doing in the UK under Tony Blair's administration. And Sir Michael Barber was the head of the delivery unit. So we invited him to Kuala Lumpur, met up with him, and I had a long chat with him about it. It became very clear to us why in the UK they set up a delivery unit. So what they did was they basically understood. Imagine there are three constellations involved in this process. First, the leadership, which is Tony Blair and the ministers and the top civil servants, the leadership. Then you have the civil service. Within the civil service, they have many things to do. They have firefighting, normal day-to-day activities. And then on this side is the small delivery unit. But these people are trying to bring in new initiatives, the things that were important to them, that we discussed, the kind of priorities at the national level. But the problem here today is that in real life, everyone on that side of the triangle, which is the civil service, including even the minister, they are bogged down with normal operation, day-to-day firefighting. And they don't have time for these initiatives. And so if you don't have a delivery unit to keep on pulling them, by the way, let me remind you, we've agreed these are the priorities. We want you to drag you back to go and do this. What will happen is that people are caught up in firefighting. That's why, however good the plans are, people revert to the old operating model, every single day focus on firefighting. And so that's what has happened. So the delivery unit, if you like, was the unit that owns the transformation architecture, insisting that the whole organization must follow the 8-step process, not missing a beat on it, making sure that they do according to the plan, and making sure that the effort is spent on it rather than, paying lip service to it. So we then decided to build an equivalent. We call it the PEMANDU Associates. PEMANDU, why we like that is the word PEMANDU is driver. It's the tagline, driving transformation.
PEMANDU means, for our international viewers and listeners, the word PEMANDU means driver in the Bahasa Malaysia language.
It's an acronym that we took from PE, that means performance. MAN, this management. DU is delivery unit, PEMANDU, and that's how we coined it. I think it was very clever to put it like that. We really are driving transformation. So what is clear about that is that PEMANDU unit does not take away the accountability from the ministry and the civil service. The civil service remain as the one who are accountable and responsible. But PEMANDU is to assist them to make sure that they deliver. So PEMANDU bring a new working approach to make sure the civil servant use the methodology to make sure implementation take place. So let me now talk about the actual most important part of what we do in this aspect called the implementation. What we've done is we moved away from what they did in the UK. We developed our own. So what I'm going to tell you is unique to what we've done here. Not anywhere is unique to Malaysia and PEMANDU. We call DMS implementation. Do it relentlessly, that's the first D. Monitor it continuously, and then solve problem recursively. And we really mean this very seriously. And in a nutshell, we use the word do it relentlessly. That means everything you said you're going to do in the roadmap, you must do it relentlessly. In the Oxford English Dictionary, relentless means you do something refusing to give up, even if it is inconvenient, and sometimes even cruel. And so you're relentless about doing it, refusing to give up, and you keep on doing it. Now, when you do that, week in and week out you do this, every Friday, we must have on the dashboard very clear who has done it, who has not done it, who is only done partially, and that must appear on the dashboard. for the entire leadership to see by names of people who didn't do it. So if you didn't do it, it's red color. If you done it, it's green. It's amber, you did partial. Why is that important? Because the next thing is called the S, solve problem recursively. This is where the rubber hits the road. Most organizations fail in implementation because don't do that. They don't solve problem recursively. What you'll find, Leon, when there's a problem in an organization, you will find that the person who is supposed to solve it, they tend to find themselves unable to solve it because it requires the help of other parties. If it's just to do with them alone, most of the time, unless they're ill will and they're incompetent, most of the time they can do it. But when it involves other parties, then they get bogged down.
Why is that?
Because everybody else is busy doing their thing. If you call them for meeting, they don't turn up for your meeting. And if you ask them for data, they don't give you full data that you require. So they don't put your priorities on the top. Now, because we create a structure that has an escalation method, people then have to comply. Let's suppose Mr. A was supposed to do something, that individual didn't do it. By the end of the week, the boss will recognize that the person didn't do it. The problem gets escalated to the boss. Within 2 weeks, the boss must resolve it. If the boss doesn't resolve it, it gets escalated to the next level and the next level. And that architecture of automatic escalation of the problem, everybody knows this. So you can't keep it under the carpet. And this is why that problem solving is very key. To my mind, anyone who says that he or she is a leader in an organization does not get involved in problem solving cannot carry the badge of being a leader in the organization. That is, I think, biggest problem in my mind of leadership, that they do not get involved in problem solving. They just keep pointing finger down the line, not wanting to help them resolve the problem. And most of the time, as I said, people don't deliver it, not because they're ill will, not because they're most of the time, but mostly because they don't get the cooperation from others. But if the boss now comes out and says, look, or you and you and you must help so-and-so during the meeting, they tend to go and do it. And this is uncomfortable because when you do this, you really put people under tremendous pressure. You get them to break down the silos and you bring in a new teamwork culture within the organization. That's how they will operate. Now, that's a large organization, Leon. You asked a question before. How do you apply a delivery unit in a small outfit, medium and small outfit? You can still do the same without having full time. Same people, but you ask them to double head. You get the same marketing manager and say, okay, you double head as the head of delivery unit. So you don't get them to do full time. But you just have to tell people, if you do this, you have to work harder because you now are double heading.
Would it be advisable to put this in as part of the JD?
Yes,
then?
yes, you must. In fact, you must do it because you must then tell them it's part of your job description. We will reward you for the additional work that's done. Better still, if you pay them an additional allowance as well.
Yeah.
If you can afford it, and you should pay them an additional allowance for taking on the additional role. But more importantly, when I get involved in an organization, I tend to want to put some of my best people in there. You know, when you put the best people there, they have tremendous pride in their work. They really go out and chase it and do it. So the word relentless, that is a part of the attribute that you're looking for people in the delivery unit. People who are relentless in whatever they do. Whether it's delivery unit or in sales, but you will find those types of people that have the same attribute. When you put people who are relentless in it, you'll see a difference in outcomes.
I think the underlying thread there is the idea of repetition.
Yeah.
If it's in the words themselves, so you are, you're problem solving recursively.
Yeah.
You're also monitoring continuously.
Yeah.
But you're also doing rigorously. All of these things imply an element of repetition.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's when we are okay with doing that. I think number one of the things that you mentioned was that, perhaps sometimes leaders feel a little burdened by the task of problem solving And perhaps I wonder that's because we have this idea that problem solving is a one-off thing. We need to have one very big concerted effort to try to solve the problem, and it has to be solved
Yeah,
in that one session,
Yeah.
and never to have another session ever again. But I think when you have this DMS approach and knowing that there will be we will have to continue to problem solve anyway.
Every week, it's
There's
a weekly
bit
affair.
less pressure to then
Yeah.
think, how do I mobilize everybody to come to this meeting and to figure out a solution that will solve the problem once and for all. That's actually never going to happen. And if you are doing that, I would argue maybe you are not really an organization that is pursuing the game of the impossible. To play the game of the impossible implies that you are continuously looking to grow, and with each new level of growth, there are new sets of challenges, new sets of problems. And so I think it's that point, whether or not we want to see it as DMS, I think if we generally have a mindset of being okay with repetition, that will set us up for success. I think both, if I look at it both biblically but also philosophically, Aristotle says that we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act but a habit.
Yeah, correct.
It's a habit.
It's
when
a habit,
we are in the habit of problem solving, when we are in the habit of implementing things rigorously, when we are in the habit of monitoring, actually the result of that just will become a natural byproduct of the discipline of action that we put in. Similarly, in the Bible, Proverbs 21 verse 5 says, the plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. I'd like to talk a little bit about this, the word haste.
Haste.
Because a big part of PEMANDU's ethos is not only that we are bent on implementation, but that also your tagline is big, fast results. So let's talk about the word fast.
Yeah.
In many ways, the fact that we are able to deliver things very quickly, that has been what has helped to set us apart from perhaps other consulting firms. But I also wonder sometimes, can there be situations where speed actually can become a bit of a downside, where I think there are some examples where people can favor speed, but then actually it doesn't become strategic anymore and simply reactive. So
true.
back to this verse, the haste, as surely as haste leads to poverty. How do you think that sometimes plays out in the corporate world?
That's a very good one. You notice, Leon, when we say big, fast result, we don't do this in isolation. The plan must be done in the lab. In the lab, the 6 weeks of deliberation about this fight between big versus fast. And so when they come with the 3-feet plan, it's very clear the true north will define how big the true north is, what's the nature of that size of the prize, and therefore the speed within which you can execute it without sacrificing the true north.
By the way, for those who are unaware of what a 3-foot plan is, can you explain that very briefly?
Well, basically what it means is that when you have a very high level of high-level implementation, you break it down to minute details so that every detail activity that is contributing towards that overall plan is then put down clearly, and that's what a 3-foot plan is. Now, coming back to the point, during the 6 weeks lab, there's tremendous discussion in the lab about this kind of trade-off, speed versus outcome. But the outcome, the true north, is defined so clearly, so people know which part of the activity requires time. So that time required is put inside there. So nobody is telling you, or if you want to build a house and to put up a cement there, there's certain time that's required for the cement to dry before you start putting things on top of the cement. Obviously, you can't simply say, oh, the cement, you dry up within 3 minutes, I want to start working, obviously. So during the entire lab process, the realities are what people put inside there to allow for time duration for things that require time. So that is why the 3-foot plan, when it's developed there, they take into account speed versus time taken required to make it correct. So back to the point that it is very important to my mind that when people are very clear about this, I want to build on the point that you said about repetition. So the 3 key words in implementation is to establish, repetitive routine. So you need a routine, repetitive routine. That means every week the routine is every name who's listed down on the 3-foot plan, if your name is there, you have to do it relentlessly, Monday to Friday, relentlessly. That's routine. On Friday, the routine is you look at the dashboard. You must look at the dashboard.
And explain why Friday.
Friday, because we want to spoil the weekends of those people who didn't do it. Because it's very uncomfortable. Because the notes are coming from the bosses to those who are red color on the traffic light that they didn't do it. What are you going to do differently on Monday? So Monday and Tuesday, Monday basically, sometimes they come on the weekend, is solving problem. So you have meetings. The routine of problem solving takes place on Monday and Tuesday. And then on the remaining part of the day is to do and implement it. So when you establish these 3 words, establish a repetitive routine. So in implementation, routine is a very important word. Without routine, there's no discipline. Without discipline, there is no stuff that Aristotle talked about in the quote that you said. You established the repetitive routine and then you develop the habit. Once you develop the habit, you don't really need a delivery unit to remind you how to do it because it's not habitual. But habit will only develop when you have done repetitive routine. And over time, you develop the memory muscle to be able to do it. Nobody needs to tell you how to do it, and it becomes natural. And that's how you build in a culture called the implementation culture. Most companies fail not because they have a poor strategy. Most of them fail because poor implementation. But of course, there will be cases where they are pursuing the wrong strategy. I want to use another term that I use the word recursively. And I already defined relentlessly. Now I want to define the word recursively. Why did we use the word solve problem recursively? It's because our general view is that to create an adaptive implementation culture, you must allow people to recursively look at the problem. That means when we say recursive, go back to the true north, Leon. The true north is unchanged, but you realize in your problem solving, some of your solutions are not correct. As I said before, the rule of thumb is that 1/3 of the solution recommended in labs which are documented in the roadmap continue. They are spot on, they will be implemented exactly, and they will deliver the outcome. Another third are the things that are needed to be refined. You didn't think about that in the lab, but in implementation, you encounter many different challenges, circumstances, so refinements required. But 1/3 is entirely new. When I say 1/3 entirely, it presupposes that 1/3 of the original solutions were flawed, not right because substances changed. So you have to drop those and come with new. Why you have to come with new? How do you know it's new? Recursive. You return back to the true north because the true north is sacrosanct. That's unchanged. So you return back to true north. If this is the true north, I now want to find new activities that will replace the one that defunct in order to make sure that they replace it and do the same and achieve the same outcome.
Could NATO have argued then that them failing to stick to the agreement as agreed originally could have been a symptom of recursive problem solving?
Yes, it could happen. If they do, how would have NATO solved the problem recursively? The way they would have done was they should have engaged Russia and said, look, we want to make a change, a variation in the original thing. And therefore, the original thing we do is that we want to go into those countries. But when we go into those countries, and if they had a proper discussion, it would have run, in my mind, I have no doubt in my mind, they would have said, Russia would have said to them, as long as you keep a neutral area in the Donbas region, the entire Donbas region, and then if you remain there, we are not annexing them, they remain part of Ukraine, but all your military thing must not go into the neutral area. That would have been perfectly reasonable. So I think if they wanted to do the 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3, that conversation should have taken place, and that the agreement for the solution would have made very explicit. And that didn't happen. And this is a failure in implementation. They were not solving the problem recursively.
Failure in implementation, but also in communication.
Yes,
I think we
absolutely.
must always remember that underpinning all of the steps that we have already covered and the remaining steps that we will cover is communication throughout every step of the process.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that we do labs, that, the thinking behind that is that we bring, in the case of government, then we bring the public sector and the private sector together. So if we were to use the same thinking, let's say NATO did have its valid reasons for making those changes, but the fact that they did not involve Russia as a key stakeholder in those discussions, that's where the fallout comes out.
Because you must always return back to the original time when they agreed to dismantle Warsaw Pact. There were two pacts. One was NATO, the other one was Warsaw. Warsaw was all the Soviet Union. That was that part. The other one, NATO, was the Western European countries. And they agreed to dismantle it on condition that NATO does not encroach and expand into those areas. And that, of course, they didn't do. And I think you're right. If they came out and did the syndication, they had a full discussion about it, then they would have come back to drawing board what is reasonable and appropriate. But I think when you really look at it, when Russia invaded Crimea, that was a very big deal. They annexed Crimea. It was a red flag. So big, the red flag, that everybody knew that Russia was dead serious about what they said they didn't accept. And so I think at that point, there was a failure of leadership, as far as I'm concerned, the word is leadership in NATO, not to have seen that red flag. Because they've seen the red flag, they knew at some point if NATO wanted to bring Ukraine into the fold, and then obviously that Russia is going to jump. Please listen to Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs has clearly gone down to tremendous detail because he was an advisor to the government of Russia for many years, and he knew exactly this. So this message is not lost. So everybody knew that was the message coming loud and clear. So it was without doubt Western Europe through NATO and also Russia, they were going into a collision course. It was no surprise to me, absolutely no surprise to me, because I know the history and I studied it as well and looked at the details of it. I knew there was going to be a period beyond Crimea that they were going to go and do it because Crimea was so strategic to them. And it was very important that that message was made loud and clear. I think NATO's fault was not wanting to see that, not bringing Russia into the fold. I'm not here to defend Russia, by the way, and
yes,
I completely
you
do
can
not
also
condone.
talk about the fact that Russia's implementation
Yeah.
of getting their message across
right.
is absolutely the wrong way to go as well.
Yeah, I think as far as they're concerned, they have sent the messages. Many times the other side didn't comply. They're stuck with the original agreement. But I think between them, it takes two to tango.
Yes.
There's no such thing as a war happening on one side. Both parties are to be blamed here. And so the saddest part, Leon, there's so many people, innocent people have died. So many people in Ukraine have left their homes. And this is really saddest part of humanity when leadership had abrogated their roles, didn't play their part, the price that ordinary people have to pay. Families are broken. Parents and children have died. People are displaced from their home permanently. So many of them out there in other countries. It is really, really sad. But when you really looked at this, I have no doubt in my mind, human beings were so fickle. We forget lessons in history. And we forget the fact that history is a thing that will tell you about what you must never do for the future. And I always tell people, yes, we can choose the colors of our future, but remember always, our present is still colored by the past. And if you ignore the lessons of history, you ignore what happened in history, like in this particular case, at the time in 1991, when the Warsaw Pact was disestablished, at that point onward, you know the agreement was made, and you know all along, step by step, NATO and Russia were on a collision course.
Let's talk about, maybe to close, what would be the best example to you of an organization or a team? This is not limited to government or business, but maybe as a fan of Chelsea Football Club.
Yeah.
Maybe let's go down that route.
Okay, that's fine.
Through the lens of sport, football, maybe.
Yeah.
What examples are there? What is the best case study of a plan implemented well?
Let me tell you, since you challenged me on Chelsea, and I'm a big fan of Chelsea Football Club. You remember we used to live in London. We were 4 years in London. You grew up there. You studied in Parkside. Chelsea Football Club was next to the school. And at that time...
Chelsea, the training ground.
For
Chelsea
training ground.
was next to our school.
At that time, Abramovich hasn't bought the club.
Yeah.
And we were losing. And we were watching some of the games and we were losing. And Mom said, why don't we change club? That's blasphemous. You don't change club just like that just because. Anyway, stuck around. Now, when Abramovich bought the club, he had the game of the impossible. He wanted to bring Chelsea up there to become champions of Europe. He wanted them to be champions of England. He was very clear. So he said, if we want to be very clear about the true north, the measure of the true north of champions of the Premier League and champions in Europe, I need the very best manager. I need the best talent. I need to put money into it. So he decided to bring in Jose Mourinho. He was relatively unknown. But he knew that this young guy, he had the audacity to think he was special.
So, special one.
Special one. So when he came in, the first thing he did in his press conference, very cocky young man, he told everybody, I'm a special one. When the media asked him, why, what makes you special? Because I'm champion. I'm champion of Europe. And he led a team that was total unknown called Porto to become champions of Europe. And he was an unknown guy. When they did that, it was not just him. Abramovich knew what kind of players was needed. So when they were looking at the players that was needed, the first acquisition by Mourinho was he wanted a striker that's big. Because the defenders in UK, they're all big and very robust. So that's why he bought Didier Drogba. And Didier Drogba was a relative unknown in Marseille. But he's a big guy. So he wanted a striker that is big, a burly striker, and that cannot be bullied. And so they then brought all other players. So they brought in a contingent of players. First season, champion of Premier League. Second year, also champion. And so they really dominated it, but he did not make it to become the champions of Europe during that time. All because, not because of him per se, but because when they were doing the penalty kick in Munich, you may remember at that time, they were just doing the penalty to become the champion. John Terry slipped. So that's why divine intervention. Many things are outside your control. What had happened was the slip that he had, that was the reason why they didn't make it. A few years later, under Abramovich, Chelsea became the champions of Europe. And that wasn't the best team. That's arguably the worst team for the reign of Abramovich, because in the Premier League, they were number 6. And they became champions of Europe. And as you can see today, that's a classic example of a plan that was devised. The true north was clear. They wanted to dominate. They wanted champions of England and champions of Europe, and they did it. So what had happened after he left? And he was forced to sell it because of the Russia and Ukraine war. He sold at 3.8 billion pounds, and all the money is given to the victims of the war. What had happened then? Everything collapsed. Everything collapsed. In the first season under the new American consortium, I think we went down to number 12. This season, we improved to number 6, having spent 1 billion pounds buying new players. This you can see today. It is, notice here, this is a club that was so successful, and it's now come down so badly. Leadership. Everything was not right. In 2 years under the American leaders, how many managers have now coached? How many have they sacked? They've sacked 5 managers.
But you could argue that Abramovich had that same, recursive problem solving
he did.
at the expense of the managers.
Yeah. But every time Abramovich changed, we kept on improving. Now, I think the key here is that you have to be very clear about what you're trying to do there. I think the strategy in the case of my viewer, the strategy that's employed by Bohli plus Clear Lake, they made a rule quite arbitrary. He said, the bulk of our players must be 25 years and below. We don't want all these experienced players. So they bought very talented kids, 19-year-old, 17-year-old, 20 years old, very little experience. And of course, that's panacea for disaster, because when you don't have the experience, it is very difficult to get, however talented you are, to become champion. And that's why I think it came down there. So that is a fault of strategy, in my view. Now, the problem today is that if you have now got over 1 year, a 2-year period, so many new players, you need a manager now to be able to groom them together and forge them into a team. So I think if they have to be advised correctly how to improve it today, they need to run a lab. If they ran a lab in Chelsea Football Club, they would have found what the problems were.
Would you like to give an open invitation to the Chelsea management?
This is an invitation. I'm a big fan of Chelsea Football Club. And I think that it's very, very important that you guys have to really figure out how to get all the teams involved, the sporting directors, plus the managers, plus the people who, the business people, everybody come together over a 6-week period, run a lab, so that it's become crystal clear how you're going to dominate English Premier League and also Champions League.
Very good. We've been able to do some BD as well while doing this podcast. I think that's a great place to end today's episode. What can we look forward to for next week's episode?
Next week's episode is, we call it 7th step. That is, when you finish implementing what you've done at the end of each year, when the results are clearly laid out, you need to validate the results to make sure that they're independently audited and validated, so that when you announce the results, people will say you did not massage the numbers. So the validation, the external validation, is very, very important. So I call that an external outside-in view. So the validation is an outside-in view of the results. But that process of external validation is also an inside-out view. That means you ask the external validators, who in the world is best practice at doing this? Can you point in the direction of this so that we can learn? So that validation process is an outside-in view and inside-out view. So that's what we will be learning next week.
Looking forward to doing that, Dad. Once again, thank you for joining us on yet another episode of The Game of Impossible. We've really enjoyed putting these episodes together. You know, for those who have maybe just joined, the purpose of doing this is really for us to document and to put out and to share our weekly father-son check-ins with the rest of you. So we have enjoyed having these conversations, and it's even better to know that there are people who have included this, to your point on discipline, to your point on habits.
Yeah.
We have had comments from people who have said that just as much as we have made a habit of checking in together, people have been making listening to our podcast a part of their habit, a part of their Friday morning routine. So we just want to say thank you to those of you who have been listening and tuning in so diligently. We will continue to be committed to putting out episodes every Friday at 6 a.m. And so we just want to say once again, thank you for your support. If you have not subscribed, we encourage you to please subscribe. It really helps us to continue to get better at our podcast, to continue to invest more as well as this podcast hopefully grows with all of you. So please do subscribe, and we look forward to bringing out a lot more episodes to you. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great week ahead.